Hey guys, tonight we're plunging straight into a realm where beauty wasn't merely uncomfortable, it was absolutely frightening. Imagine this. It's the Middle Ages, and to be seen as attractive, you essentially had to appear almost lifeless. Envision skin that's eerily white, cheeks that look drawn in, and eyes ringed with shadows that could pass for bruises. You might not make it through this era alive, but relax. It's only a story for bedtime. So, before settling in, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe if you truly like what I'm sharing here. Tell me what time it is, where you are, and your location. It's always fun to see who's tuning in from different spots around the globe. Now lower the lights. Perhaps switch on a fan for that gentle white noise. And let's settle into this evening's tale together. You're in a chilly stone room, illuminated faintly by wavering candle flames. The atmosphere carries hints of beeswax and aged fabric. You perch in front of a distorted bronze mirror, attempting to refine your appearance. But what counts as ideal in the 14th century? To begin with, if your complexion shows any trace of tan, you're already at a disadvantage. Pale skin wasn't simply favored, it was essential. It signaled riches. A suntan implied you toiled outside like common folk. Disgusting. Yet mere paleness fell short. You required skin so sheer that blue veins showed clearly across your forehead and décolletage. That fragile, nearly corpse-like vibe was the height of allure. So, how did folks achieve this? Mainly via a dreadful mix of bleeding procedures and remaining indoors like some ancient bloodsucker. You could slather on a dense mixture of vinegar, ground pearls, and lead to lighten your tone. Yes, real lead. It stung, ate away at your skin, and over time tainted your blood. But at least you appeared noble in the process. A notable historical figure who exemplifies this is Queen Elizabeth of York. Her portraits display an extraordinarily white face, gaunt cheeks, and shadowy eyes set against a broad forehead. All classic markers of beauty back then, though experts debate if these images captured reality or merely idealized dreams. She might have looked that way, or perhaps not. What we do know is that resembling a warmed-over corpse was the dominant style, and women embraced it fully. Now picture striving for that iconic hollowed cheek appearance. In an era predating makeup palettes, you'd turn to genuine deprivation. Affluent ladies were famous for restricting their intake not only to remain slender, but to preserve that faintly empty, otherworldly facial structure. Some would chew lemons or apply them to their faces, expecting the acidity to draw out the fullness from their features. Seems invented, doesn't it? Not at all. That's an authentic medieval secret shared among noblewomen. We can't overlook the influence of creators. Medieval artists weren't aiming for lifelike accuracy. The visages they created were shaped by tiers of spiritual demands and societal daydreams. Flawless, deathly pale skin wasn't merely attractive, it was sacred. A virtuous spirit needed a flawless vessel. And that involved no imperfections, no hue, no vitality. If fortune favored you, the neighborhood painter might add gold accents to enhance your aura. Otherwise, you'd end up resembling a stylish specter. But here's the odd, nearly humorous irony. While aristocratic ladies desperately aimed for a frail and colorless look, Rural women were genuinely vibrant. They possessed sun-warmed skin from laboring in the fields, sturdy arms from carrying buckets, and flushed cheeks from fresh air. To the upper class, this was appalling. To us, it's honestly invigorating. Still, the gap was no joke. If a high-born woman caught too much sun and her tone deepened, it might spark outrage. She could forfeit prestige, or even worse, be viewed as ethically declining. That's how closely attractiveness and morality were intertwined. Your features didn't merely represent you, they proclaimed your entire essence. And if they didn't match the icy white norm, the community ensured you felt the consequences. Now here's an interesting small fact. There was a fad, particularly in northern Italy, of applying leeches for health and cosmetic purposes alike. Need to eliminate a blemish or fade your shade a bit? Attach a couple of leeches to your face and allow them to work. Folks truly thought the blood they extracted removed toxins. Scientific? Hardly. Agonizing? Definitely. Effective? Questionable at best. And on the topic of discussions, there's a continuing academic conversation about whether this entire attractiveness norm was imposed more via real trends or through writings and artwork. Certain historians claim most women never fully embraced these appearances. It was more of a goal than a practice. Others propose that numerous elite women, especially at court, treated these criteria seriously and genuinely modified their physiques and habits to align with them. Who's correct? We might never determine. Personal accounts from that period are scarce. And attractiveness wasn't a subject people discussed openly. It was simply assumed. But that's the core issue. The harshness of these criteria wasn't solely in the toxic lead mixtures or the hunger methods. It was in the unspoken pressure. There was no way out, no empowerment campaign. If you didn't fit in, you weren't simply out of style. You were questionable, perhaps immoral, perhaps ill, perhaps all of it. So you gaze at your image in that hazy mirror. Your skin burns from the vinegar. Your cheeks throb from being sculpted by abstinence. The flame dances, and you glimpse your face differently. Let's not ignore the eyebrows. They had to vanish as well. Women plucked them until barely a trace lingered. This wasn't due to disliking emotion. It was because eyebrows were viewed as diverting, even coarse. A lady's face was meant to be a blank canvas, like a sacred artifact or a sculpture. Feelings were chaotic. Feelings made you mortal. And mortality was somewhat disapproved of. And here's an unusual one. Some women went beyond simple depilation. They actually colored their scalp and the leftover edges of hair near the forehead to heighten the skin's whiteness by comparison. Picture spreading white chalk or powdered bone residue just above your brows. So the entire face radiated with artificial pallor. It wasn't appealing. It wasn't authentic. It was required. Naturally, none of this came without discomfort. Infections happened frequently. The instruments were basic, sanitation dubious, and any mistake could result in a gash or irritated skin. And don't consider pausing this regimen. Allow your hairline to advance even slightly, and the rumors begin. Is she slacking? Has she strayed from righteousness? Maybe she's destitute. Maybe something graver. Now, not everybody embraced this insanity. In certain parts of medieval Europe, particularly countryside regions, women outright rejected this craze. They had greater worries like avoiding hypothermia or perishing during delivery. But among the gentry and palaces from Paris to London, this was the benchmark. Attractiveness wasn't solely visual. It was a societal agreement. Violate it, and you jeopardized your romantic opportunities, your standing, even your legacy. Historians continue to dispute exactly how prevalent this fixation on the forehead was. Some contend it was confined to style-obsessed royal circles. Others think it filtered into bourgeois homes where women mimicked the aristocracy out of ambition or necessity. The reality likely sits in between, as with much of history. But what's indisputable is that the elevated forehead turned into a cultural symbol for womanliness, integrity, and noble poise. It's disturbing, truly. In an era where women possessed so few options, managing your looks became one of the few methods to claim identity. But even that option was a snare. You weren't selecting your appearance. You were selecting your suffering. So you bend closer in your candle-illuminated mirror, skin stinging from the vinegar and your scalp inflamed from tweezing. Your hairline is sufficiently receded to satisfy scrutiny, and your eyebrows are scarcely noticeable. You appear tranquil, mute, inscrutable, and frankly, somewhat eerie. Okay, so your skin is adequately white. Excellent. You've succeeded in resembling a mobile illustration from a manuscript depicting a phantom. But now it's time to address something even odder. Your forehead. Yes, your forehead. Because in the Middle Ages, the taller it appeared, the more desirable you were. And if you believe contemporary highlighting techniques are intense, prepare yourself. Because now you're receding your hairline, actually with tweezers, strand by strand. This isn't a prank. The perfect medieval lady possessed a forehead that extended nearly to her crown. It was regarded as an indicator of intellect, nobility, and divine cleanliness. And to attain that style, women tweezed, shaved, or even abraded their skin with walnut oil or cloths drenched in vinegar to induce hair loss. Eyebrows erased, fine hairs banished. Occasionally, they even shaved the front of their scalp back an inch or two simply to extend that hairline further. Consider it the original oversized forehead. And it was prized. The concept fueling this forehead fascination is still contested by scholars. Was it grounded in genuine attractiveness ideals, or did it originate from spiritual imagery? Numerous portrayals of the Virgin Mary featured her with a lofty, seamless forehead. No wonder, given the Church dominated much of artistry and society. A sleek, blank brow represented a composed, restrained demeanor. You weren't meant to appear passionate. You were meant to appear peaceful. Now envision the everyday upkeep. You sit near the fireplace in the dim early light, tweezers ready, pulling out hairs while fighting back tears. Because if you weep, your face swells, and then you'll need to apply mashed rose petals under your eyes to lessen the puffiness. Attractiveness in this era is an occupation, and you don't get vacations. There's a remarkably odd story from medieval France about a noblewoman named Isabeau of Bavaria. According to folklore, and fine, perhaps some embellished reports, she tweezed her hairline so vigorously that it irreparably harmed the follicles on her head. For years afterward, she donned intricate head coverings to conceal the uneven bald spots. These accessories became so large and burdensome that they ultimately led to neck issues. And no, chiropractors didn't exist then, just supplications. Speaking of head attire, the lofty forehead didn't operate in isolation. It was paired with ornate wimples, hennons, and snoods, all designed to highlight and accentuate the forehead. The hennon, that conical fairy tale princess hat, was frequently tilted rearward so the forehead took center stage. Extra credit if your forehead displayed veins. That indicated your skin was fine and fragile, like vellum, and vellum was adored. What's especially amusing and somewhat dreadful is that even if you lacked the proper forehead, you still had to simulate it. Portrait painters would elongate your face and amplify your brow regardless of your preference. In fact, some contemporary scholars now suspect that many of those perfect ratios in medieval artworks weren't genuine at all. They were altered the way social media apps refine your traits today. The more things evolve, right? No one wanted to be that lady at court. The one with the attractive face and dragon breath. Now here's where it gets stranger. In some medieval courts, there was an unspoken code about when a woman could show her teeth. A smile was allowed, but only the faintest, tightest version, something Mona Lisa level. No open laughter. That would reveal too much. Plus, joy wasn't considered especially feminine. You were supposed to look ethereal, slightly sad, like you were waiting for your husband to return from war or for God to call you home. Anything more enthusiastic than that risked being seen as inappropriate. There's even a fringe theory among historians, definitely debated, that upper-class women were sometimes trained to suppress laughter. The idea being that joy made the face contort, which could reveal teeth, deepen smile lines, or ruin the delicate balance of their powdered skin. Whether this was a formal instruction or just a result of relentless social pressure, we may never know. But the concept of facial restraint was very real. Beauty wasn't just about how you looked. It was about how still you could remain. Let's pause and consider. Imagine being a teenager in this world. Your friends are all trying to figure out how to make their teeth smaller and less noticeable. No braces, no whitening strips, just prayers and pumice. If you were born with crooked or large teeth, tough luck. You might be laughed at, avoided, or quietly pitied. Some wealthier families even went so far as to remove visible molars to make their daughters' mouths look smaller. The pain, the risk of infection, worth it, apparently for the chance of a good marriage. It wasn't all hopeless, though. Some medieval beauty manuals, rare ones tucked away in monastic libraries, offered gentle remedies for whitening teeth and freshening breath without completely destroying your mouth. One such manuscript recommends rubbing sage leaves on the teeth and drinking wine infused with mint. Honestly, that's one of the more reasonable tips we've heard so far. And yet, it's the quiet cruelty that lingers. The idea that you must silence your body to be seen as good. You had to shrink everything, your voice, your mouth, your appetite. The smaller you appeared, literally and metaphorically, the more perfect you became. So here you are again, sitting in your chamber. You haven't smiled in hours. You chew fennel seeds between meals and scrape your teeth with crushed eggshells. You avoid laughing even when something's funny. Because beauty in this time, it's not joy, it's discipline. And if your teeth are starting to hurt, don't worry. That just means it's working. Your forehead is now the envy of every noble woman from London to Lubeck. You've sacrificed your eyebrows, your scalp, and probably your sanity. But you're finally achieving that prized look. A pale, expressionless canvas, ready to be admired and judged. But don't think you can relax just yet. Tonight, we descend further into the mouth of madness. We're talking teeth. Tiny, discreet, impossibly delicate teeth that never show, never smile too widely, and absolutely must not look like you've ever eaten anything harder than a grape. In medieval beauty law, the mouth was a contradiction. It had to be there, obviously, but it shouldn't do much. No loud laughing, no toothy grins, no yelling across the courtyard because your goat got loose again. Lips were meant to stay closed, demure, mysterious, and teeth. The smaller, the better. Ideally, your teeth were white, small, evenly spaced, and invisible 90% of the time. If someone actually saw your teeth, you were doing femininity wrong. This standard was rooted in more than just aesthetic taste. It had moral implications. A small, closed mouth was considered a sign of modesty and self-control. Large teeth or a wide mouth, by contrast, were associated with gluttony, vulgarity, and sometimes even sexual promiscuity. Women with big mouths were seen as loud, opinionated, or worst of all, unladylike. The goal was to seem like you barely existed, just a soft breeze of a person with delicate bone structure and no opinions. Fun times. There's a fascinating passage in a 14th century French romance where the male hero praises the heroine's beauty by saying her teeth are so fine and small they would not break the skin of a grape. Romantic, right? Unless you're eating steak. Then you're doomed. It's hard to chew nobly when your teeth are functionally ornamental. But medieval oral hygiene? Yeah, that was another nightmare altogether. They didn't exactly have Colgate. People used a mix of herbs, vinegar, salt, and even burnt rosemary ash to scrub their teeth, assuming they even bothered. Most commoners didn't. Among the elite, it was a little more common, but the focus was more on appearance than health. So, while you might rub your gums raw trying to whiten your teeth, the idea of actually preventing tooth decay, that wasn't the priority. Which leads us to one of the more ironic tragedies of the period. The women who tried the hardest to maintain their teeth often did the most damage. There are records of women using ground coral and brick dust to polish their enamel. Yes, brick dust. It looked good until their enamel was completely gone and their teeth began crumbling in their gums. The ultimate in medieval beauty. Small, pearly teeth that eventually rotted out of your skull. But at least you looked pious doing it. Then there was the matter of breath. You couldn't show off your tiny, perfect teeth with breath that smelled like boiled eel and sadness. So, medieval women chewed herbs, often parsley, mint, or cloves. Some also used rosewater mouth rinses, which didn't do much medically, but at least covered up the evidence of a questionable diet. In some parts of Italy, women were known to chew fennel seeds and even sprinkle ground cinnamon into their mouths before social events. No one wanted to be that woman at court. The one with the pretty face and dragon breath. Now here's where it gets stranger. In some medieval courts, there was an unspoken code about when a woman could show her teeth. A smile was allowed, but only the faintest, tightest version, something Mona Lisa level. No open laughter. That would reveal too much. Plus, joy wasn't considered especially feminine. You were supposed to look ethereal, slightly sad, like you were waiting for your husband to return from war or for God to call you home. Anything more enthusiastic than that risked being seen as inappropriate. There's even a fringe theory among historians, definitely debated, that upper-class women were sometimes trained to suppress laughter. The idea being that joy made the face contort, which could reveal teeth, deepen smile lines, or ruin the delicate balance of their powdered skin. Whether this was a formal instruction or just a result of relentless social pressure, we may never know. But the concept of facial restraint was very real. Beauty wasn't just about how you looked. It was about how still you could remain. Let's pause and consider. Imagine being a teenager in this world. Your friends are all trying to figure out how to make their teeth smaller and less noticeable. No braces, no whitening strips, just prayers and pumice. If you were born with crooked or large teeth, tough luck. You might be laughed at, avoided, or quietly pitied. Some wealthier families even went so far as to remove visible molars to make their daughters' mouths look smaller. The pain, the risk of infection, worth it, apparently for the chance of a good marriage. It wasn't all hopeless, though. Some medieval beauty manuals, rare ones tucked away in monastic libraries, offered gentle remedies for whitening teeth and freshening breath without completely destroying your mouth. One such manuscript recommends rubbing sage leaves on the teeth and drinking wine infused with mint. Honestly, that's one of the more reasonable tips we've heard so far. And yet, it's the quiet cruelty that lingers. The idea that you must silence your body to be seen as good. You had to shrink everything, your voice, your mouth, your appetite. The smaller you appeared, literally and metaphorically, the more perfect you became. So, here you are again, sitting in your chamber. You haven't smiled in hours. You chew fennel seeds between meals and scrape your teeth with crushed eggshells. You avoid laughing even when something's funny. Because beauty in this time, it's not joy, it's discipline. And if your teeth are starting to hurt, don't worry. That just means it's working. You're pale, hollowed, hairless in all the wrong places, and your mouth is small enough to pass medieval inspection. At this point, you should be golden, right? But no, because now comes the part that ties it all together. Being thin. Not just thin, but fragile, ethereal, one skipped meal away from sainthood. Because in the Middle Ages, looking like you hadn't eaten in days wasn't just fashionable. It was holy. Fasting wasn't just for monks and mystics. Among noble women, not eating became a badge of both spiritual devotion and social superiority. The thinner you were, the more virtuous you were assumed to be. A woman with a full figure might be considered healthy, sure, but she was also suspected of indulgence, gluttony, or even moral weakness. The ideal body was soft, but slight, delicate, but shapely, like a sculpture that might break if you breathed too hard on it. This wasn't some quiet internal practice either. In many aristocratic courts, fasting was flaunted. Women would attend feasts but barely touch the food, delicately sipping wine or picking at a piece of bread with exaggerated grace. It wasn't just about health. It was about power. Denying yourself pleasure, especially in public, sent a message. I am in control. I am closer to God. I am better than you. Now let's talk about Saint Catherine of Siena. She's probably one of the most famous examples of religious fasting in the medieval era. Catherine claimed to survive for years on nothing but the Eucharist, literally a piece of communion bread. Some historians today believe she may have suffered from a condition now recognized as anorexia, though obviously no one called it that back then. Her starvation was interpreted as divine devotion. She was canonized, and her image, gaunt, sunken, glowing, became part of the beauty and spiritual ideal for women for centuries. And here's where it gets even murkier. Spiritual purity and physical appearance weren't just connected. They were indistinguishable. A woman who was naturally thin and pale could be seen as blessed, maybe even saint-like. A woman who had to work at it through starvation, herbs that induced vomiting or long nights of self-flagellation was still admired, but with a different flavor of reverence. She was admired for her suffering. There are quirky tidbits too, like the popularity of something called holy anorexia. It wasn't a medical term, obviously, but a spiritual label applied to women who fasted to the point of hallucination and ecstasy. Some noble families even encouraged this behavior in their daughters, seeing it as a shortcut to sainthood, or at least a way to increase the family's religious prestige. That's right. Starving your child could be a career move. And don't get the wrong idea. Men were doing similar things, especially in monasteries, but it hit women differently. Fasting became not just a religious act, but a gendered performance. You weren't just purging your body of sin. You were proving that you were too holy for hunger, too pure for earthly needs. Your body wasn't yours anymore. It was a shrine. But let's rewind to the daily grind of it. Imagine waking up in your cold stone chamber with a roaring fire that doesn't actually do much. Your maidservant brings in your breakfast, a stale crust of rye and a cup of goat's milk, but you wave it away. You're fasting, which really just means keeping up appearances. Your head aches, your limbs are weak, but you smile faintly and go about your day. You faint during morning prayers. Everyone pretends not to notice. Among your circle of noble women, there's an unspoken competition. Who can eat the least? Who can go the longest between meals? Who can survive on herbs and broth and still stand upright at Mass? It's brutal. It's isolating. It is revered. Even the fashion of the time reinforced this. Gowns were tight around the rib cage and torso, emphasizing a narrow waist. Lacing was used to cinch the body, not yet full corsetry, but an early form of it. Some gowns had no stretch and could barely accommodate a full breath, let alone a meal. The silhouette of the day was long, narrow, almost reed-like. Rounded curves were okay. Hips and busts had their place, but the stomach had to be flat, the ribs discreet. Your whole frame was supposed to say, I exist on air and prayer. Scholars still argue about how far these standards actually reached. Were all noble women really starving themselves? Or were the ideals exaggerated by male poets, clerics, and artists projecting their fantasies onto female bodies? There's definitely truth to that. A lot of what we know comes from secondhand sources. Men writing about women, artists painting exaggerated saints, religious leaders praising devotion while quietly destroying lives. But the physical evidence where it exists, corseted bones, letters, manuscripts, suggests that many women lived these expectations day after day. There were also class divisions. Of course, peasant women couldn't afford to fast, nor would anyone expect them to. They needed energy to survive their lives. Field work, childbirth, constant labor. But the higher up the social ladder you climbed, the more your plate had to stay empty. The irony, the rich had access to food and were praised for pretending they didn't want it. And just to drive it home, here's a weird little fact. Some women would chew food and then discreetly spit it into napkins to avoid digestion. That's right, pre-digestion food rejection. A casual court-approved eating disorder centuries before anyone had a name for it. So now here you are again. It's dinner time in your candlelit hall. Your lord is eating roast pheasant. The smell so rich it makes your stomach twist. You sip watered wine and pretend to be indifferent. Your gown is tight across your ribs. You haven't eaten a full meal in days, but everyone praises your lightness and your grace. You feel dizzy and someone leans over and says, "You look radiant tonight." You manage a faint smile. You're starving. But that's the point. You've stopped eating. You've erased your eyebrows. And you've shrunk your mouth into a delicate, well-mannered smirk. But you're not quite finished. Because now it's time to talk about the final and arguably most unachievable layer of medieval beauty. Purity. Not just physical purity, but the big one. The one that loomed over every girl from the moment she could walk in a straight line. Virginity. And not the real-life kind either. We're talking about a fantasy version of chastity spun together with threads of religious dogma, courtly love poetry, and more than a little wishful thinking. This is the virgin ideal. In the Middle Ages, a beautiful woman wasn't just physically appealing. She had to look and act like she had never even heard of sex. And if she was married, well, ideally, she still seemed virginal. The standard was ridiculous, ethereal, and untouchable, graceful, but completely innocent, mysterious, but also morally transparent. Basically, you were expected to be a walking contradiction in a really expensive dress. It all stemmed, of course, from the religious climate. The Virgin Mary was the ultimate role model. She was seen as the perfect woman, kind, obedient, selfless, and eternally untouched. Artists and poets bent over backward to make her the centerpiece of womanhood. That meant real women, living, breathing, complex women, were expected to mold themselves into that impossible shape. Pale, passive, and pure. Let's put you in the mindset. You're 13, maybe 14, old enough for marriage negotiations to begin. Your mother has already warned you to walk modestly, avoid eye contact with men, and never speak above a whisper unless addressed directly. You've been taught how to sit with your ankles crossed, how to lower your eyes demurely, and how to say no, with just the right amount of angelic confusion. You've also been warned that even looking too interested in something, anything, might make people think you're impure. Passion, after all, was suspicious. Even your clothing reflects this bizarre blend of innocence and allure. Your dress might be modest in cut, but made from expensive fabrics that whisper privilege. You might wear a veil over your hair, not just for fashion, but because visible hair was associated with temptation. The more covered you were, the more good you appeared. Modesty wasn't just suggested, it was legally enforced in some regions, literally. In parts of medieval Italy, laws dictated how much skin unmarried women could show. Yes, they had purity police. There's this fascinating story about Agnes of Rome, a 12-year-old girl canonized for refusing to marry and protecting her chastity to the death. Her legend became a popular tale for young women, taught as a lesson in devotion and moral superiority. In art, she's often shown with a lamb, symbol of innocence, and a face so expressionless you'd think she'd been mildly sedated. This apparently was the vibe everyone was supposed to emulate. Pure, passive, silent. And here's the kicker. Even your physical features were supposed to reflect your purity. Small nose, delicate and modest. Large eyes, great, as long as they didn't sparkle with too much curiosity. High, smooth forehead, of course, because nothing says virgin like an enormous blank canvas above your brows. Medieval writers described beautiful women with skin whiter than milk, hair like gold threads, and voices so soft they could not disturb a bird. That last one sounds poetic until you realize it basically means you shouldn't speak above a whisper ever. But let's talk about hair for a second. In medieval symbolism, hair was a loaded gun. Loose hair on a woman was associated with seduction, danger, and lack of control. This is why brides wore their hair down only on their wedding day, symbolizing both virginity and transition. After that, it was covered or braided tightly, because leaving it loose would be like walking around with a neon sign flashing might be a temptress. The rules were unspoken, but rigid. You didn't want to be mistaken for a loose woman because the consequences were brutal. Speaking of which, the stakes for falling short of this ideal weren't just social, they were physical. A woman suspected of sexual impurity could be shamed, disinherited, exiled, even killed. It didn't take much. A rumor, a jealous suitor, an unfortunately timed encounter in a garden. The noble family's daughters were political currency. If a girl's virginity came into question, it could sink entire marriage alliances. So, yes, the pressure was real, and yes, it was constant. There's a strange scholarly debate about whether these purity standards actually affected women's day-to-day lives, or if they were just idealized projections from male-dominated literature and religious doctrine. On one hand, poetry from the era is overflowing with references to untouched maidens and flawless beauties. On the other, real women sometimes found ways to work the system. Some used their virgin reputations as bargaining chips. Others faked virginity with herbs and clever storytelling. A few even went full holy maiden and joined convents to escape the whole marriage mess entirely. A quirky historical tidbit. In some regions, midwives were trained to restore virginity through minor surgeries or herbal treatments. Basically, the medieval version of a hymenoplasty. It wasn't common, but it happened. Reputation was everything, and people would go to extraordinary lengths to protect it. And yet, despite all these impossible expectations, women still laughed, gossiped, flirted, even loved. They wrote poems, traded secrets, and found moments of rebellion. That they did so behind veils, under layers of fabric, and always with one eye over their shoulder. Because in the medieval world, being seen as impure wasn't just a gossip risk. It could destroy your life. So here you are, sitting in the garden under the careful gaze of your chaperone. You speak softly, hands folded, eyes lowered. You're 13, but you already know the script by heart. You must be beautiful, yes, but not too much. Innocent, but not naive. Seen, but not heard. You hear a giggle from behind the hedge. Some other girl, less careful than you, may be whispering with a page boy. You tense, not because you're jealous, because you know how quickly that kind of thing becomes a story. And in this world, a single story can become your legacy. So, you've nailed the holy trifecta. Pale, quiet, and virginal. But something's missing. Your hair, your literal crown, isn't just dangling there by accident. No. In the medieval world, your hair color could make or break your entire existence. And if you were truly aiming for elite beauty status, only one color would do. Blonde. Not honey blonde, not brassy yellow. We're talking luminous sun-kissed strands of spun gold, preferably glowing like a holy halo under candlelight. And if you weren't born with it, too bad. You just have to fake it, even if it meant burning your scalp with homemade bleach. This obsession with golden hair didn't come out of nowhere. In medieval Europe, blonde was shorthand for purity, youth, and heavenly grace. Artists painted angels and saints with flowing blonde locks, even if they were depicting women from regions where blonde hair wasn't exactly genetically common. The symbolism ran deep. Blonde meant divine. Blonde meant delicate. Blonde meant you'd probably die young. And wasn't that just lovely? For brunettes and redheads, this was a problem. So, women got to work with a variety of horrifying DIY treatments to lighten their hair. One method involved soaking your hair in a concoction of lye, alum, and stale urine. Yes, urine. Before sitting in the sun for hours. It didn't always work, but when it did, you'd end up with dried-out straw-like blonde strands and likely chemical burns, beauty win. Maybe nerve damage, possibly. One particularly infamous beauty recipe comes from a 15th century Italian manuscript instructing women to mix saffron, lemon juice, and goat's urine, apply it to the hair, and then sit outside with a wide-brimmed hat that had the top cut out. So just your hair would roast in the sun. The goal: lift the pigment. The result? Sometimes it worked, but usually it just fried your hair into a crispy halo of medieval regret. And don't think you could just wear a wig. Wigs were rare and seen as theatrical or deceptive, plus extremely hot and itchy under layers of wimples and veils. Some women used thin veils dyed with golden hues to give the illusion of blonde hair peeking through. But it was no substitute for the real thing. You wanted the shine, the shimmer, the approval of everyone from your priest to your suitor. And if it cost you your scalp, so be it. A historical example. Let's talk about Lucrezia Borgia. While she lived slightly post-medieval in the early Renaissance, her golden hair was so famous that it was sent as a diplomatic gift. Literally, Strands of her hair were preserved in jewelry and letters as tokens of power and allure. Whether it was her natural color or achieved through early bleach jobs is up for debate, but the point is clear. Golden hair meant influence. It turned women into legends, or at least well-married nobles. Of course, this aesthetic ideal excluded whole populations. Dark-haired women, especially those from Southern Europe or the Middle East, were often portrayed as seductive, dangerous, or morally ambiguous. In medieval poetry, a dark-haired temptress usually spelled trouble for the hero, while the golden-haired maiden was the one he'd take home to his castle. The racial and cultural undertones here are obvious. Blonde wasn't just beautiful, it was seen as better. Now here's where it gets interesting. While the church pushed for modesty and chastity, the romantic literature of the time, courtly love tales, troubadour poetry, fueled the obsession with blonde hair even more. In these stories, the perfect lady was always golden-haired, gentle, and mysteriously sad. Men fell to their knees for her, sang ballads under her window, or died in duels defending her honor. Blonde hair became the symbol not just of holiness, but of high drama. So, naturally, women copied the ideal, even if they knew it was fiction, even if they knew it was dangerous. There's a documented case in 14th century England of a noble woman who went blind after accidentally getting bleach in her eyes during a hair lightening session. Her servants testified that she'd been trying to match the golden shade of a lady in a painting. Art imitating life, or life imitating art with a side of permanent eye damage. But the consequences weren't always so visible. Repeated chemical treatments led to hair loss, infections, and open sores on the scalp. And let's not forget the smell. Many of these bleaching agents, especially urine-based ones, left women smelling like a farm animal in high summer. You'd walk into court looking like Aphrodite, but reeking like the stables. The things people did for beauty. And still, it wasn't just about hair color. It was about what that color represented. You weren't just bleaching your hair. You were bleaching your entire identity. You were aligning yourself with a mythic version of womanhood, one that was unattainable for most and deadly for some. Blonde was a shortcut to grace, to love, to heaven. And it wasn't fair. But then, nothing about medieval beauty was. Historians still argue over how much pressure women actually felt to conform to these blonde ideals. Some scholars say it was mostly limited to elite courts and aristocratic circles, where women had both the time and the resources to ruin their hair for fashion. Others argue that the obsession trickled down into the merchant and middle classes, especially in cities like Venice and Florence, where visual culture was booming and appearance meant opportunity. There's even evidence that men played into this too, not with hair color, but by writing endless odes to sun-haired maidens and golden angels. The poetic imagery set the bar, and women were expected to meet it. Never mind genetics, never mind chemistry. Just bleach, pray, and roast in the sun like a delicate glowing meatball. So now, back in your chamber, you sit by the window with your scalp still stinging. You've followed the recipe from that whispered beauty manual. The sun beats down through the open circle in your straw hat. Your hair steams. You smell faintly of lemons and livestock. A servant fans you lazily. You feel lightheaded, But maybe that's just the fumes. Later at court, someone glances your way. Your hair catches the candlelight. It shimmers. For a moment, you think, maybe this was worth it. Then someone else turns to look and another. You smile faintly and tell yourself not to scratch your head because it still really, really burns. At this point, you've probably figured out that medieval beauty was less about being alive and more about looking like you were slowly fading out of existence. But don't think for a second that this obsession with delicate looks meant people actually smelled delicate. Welcome to the rank underbelly of medieval beauty culture, where baths were rare, sweat was constant, and your nose was the unsung hero trying to get you through each day without fainting. First off, no, medieval people weren't completely allergic to washing. They bathed more than the myth suggests when they could. But for noble women, hygiene wasn't always about health. It was about optics. You were supposed to smell fresh and floral, yes, but without getting wet. Actual bathing was seen as potentially dangerous to the soul or even harmful to fertility. Plus, medical experts of the time claimed that hot water opened your pores, making you more vulnerable to disease, sin, or both. Because nothing screams medical knowledge like blaming your bathtub for a plague outbreak. So what did women do? Instead of bathing, they perfumed a lot. They doused themselves in rose water, lavender oils, crushed violets, and even spiced vinegar. Some stuffed their undergarments with dried herbs like mint, marjoram, and thyme, basically turning their corsets into medieval potpourri sachets. Linen shifts and veils were also frequently laundered, more so than the body itself, in a constant attempt to trick people into thinking cleanliness was happening. And then came the masks. No, not COVID style, but scent masks. Perfumed gloves, pomanders, small perforated balls filled with aromatic resins, and even garlands worn around the neck or pinned inside dresses. These weren't just decorative. They were olfactory armor. The upper classes understood that things stank. The key was to stink better. Let's talk about hair since we just tortured it in the last section. If you thought scalp care was a modern obsession, think again. Medieval women often went weeks without washing their hair. Instead, rubbing it with scented oils to mask the natural buildup. Rosemary, clove oil, and bay leaves were popular choices, not for cleanliness, but to convince people your head hadn't turned into a small ecosystem. One quirky tip from a 14th century beauty manual recommends boiling rosemary in wine and using the mixture to rinse the hair and cheer the brain. Sounds nice until you remember how often lice made themselves at home in those braids and veils. Delousing was a constant, itchy battle. Women used special combs, vinegar rinses, and prayers. Lots of prayers. Now not everyone could afford the luxury of smell-masking oils and herbs. For poorer women, especially in the cities, public bathhouses were a more realistic option until the church decided they were too sinful. Because apparently bathing in the same room as other people was a gateway drug to lust, disease, and moral collapse. Many bathhouses were shut down or heavily regulated, and women were expected to wash modestly at home using a basin, a cloth, and whatever level of shame they could muster. But here's where things get contradictory again. The same society that scolded women for washing too much also expected them to look and smell immaculate. Not just passably clean, but spiritually fragrant. Writers of the time would describe their ideal women as smelling like lilies, honey, or spring rain. Never sweat, never food, never, God forbid, reality. And of course, the pressure to smell right wasn't evenly distributed. Noble women were held to impossible standards. You were expected to sit through hours of court, layers of heavy clothing, stuffy rooms, and still somehow radiate the scent of divine approval. One wrong whiff, and suddenly the gossip started. She's been riding too much, someone might whisper. Or worse, she's not what she pretends to be. One historical figure worth mentioning here is Isolde of Brittany, the often overlooked foil to the famous Isolde in the Tristan legend. She was praised not just for her golden hair and pale skin, but for smelling like flowers even after travel. Whether that was a poetic metaphor or just the result of an extreme perfume habit, we'll never know. But the idea stuck. The perfect woman didn't just look good. She smelled like a meadow in May. Of course, there's a scholarly debate around how seriously we should take all this. Some historians argue that medieval people were far more pragmatic than the surviving beauty manuals suggest. But maybe the pressure to stay fragrant wasn't quite so dramatic. Others point to court documents, letters, and poems that obsess over scent as evidence that yes, this was a big deal. And when you consider how rare bathing was, it starts to make sense. In a world full of natural funk, smelling even slightly better than average could be a social power move. There's even an awkward fringe theory that certain religious relics, like the bodies of saints that supposedly smelled sweet after death, were exaggerated to support this scent-based beauty obsession. If even dead holy women were supposed to smell like roses, what hope did a sweaty, sun-drenched noble woman have? So, it's morning again. You're standing near the hearth, rubbing lavender-scented oil on your wrists. A maid combs your unwashed hair, carefully pulling out whatever decided to move in overnight. You dab rose water on your neck, tuck a sachet of mint into your bodice, and inhale deeply. You don't feel clean, not really, but you smell acceptable. Maybe even good. Later in court, a knight passes close by and pauses. He leans in. "You smell," he says softly, like the first day of spring. You smile faintly. You're sweating under your layers. Your scalp itches, and you haven't had a real bath in weeks. But no one has to know. Let's say the lavender oil didn't quite do the trick. And your natural medieval musk is getting ambitious. No worries, because this is where you reach into your little wooden cosmetics chest and pull out the really serious stuff, your skin cream. And by cream, we mean a bubbling cauldron of ingredients so toxic even your local apothecary raises an eyebrow. Tonight, you're diving into the glamorous and horrifying world of medieval makeup, where lead, mercury, arsenic, and vinegar were casually mixed into something you smeared directly onto your face. Let's start with ceruse. Sounds elegant, doesn't it? Like some French artisanal paste sold in a boutique. In reality, ceruse was a thick white paint made from vinegar and white lead, aged in clay pots until it congealed into a smooth, deadly cream. Women used it to achieve that perfect no-blood circulating here look. Ceruse covered freckles, blotches, and the overall stress of surviving in a world with no antibiotics or civil rights. It made you look angelic. It also made your skin peel off in strips if you wore it too often. One documented case involved a noble woman in England who used ceruse daily to maintain her famously pale complexion. Eventually, Her skin became so raw and damaged that she had to have her maid apply it for her, avoiding open wounds. Did she stop using it? No, of course not. Beauty standards wait for no one. She simply upped the dosage to mask the damage caused by the product itself. A vicious loop centuries before Instagram filters. And lead wasn't the only villain. Mercury, too, had its moment in the spotlight. It was found in spot removers designed to fade blemishes, age spots, or any sign of sun damage. The cream was applied at night, often while wearing a mask or wrapping your face in cloth so the product could work its magic. Magic here meaning nerve damage, tremors, hallucinations, and eventual organ failure. But hey, anything to get rid of that one freckle that keeps showing up when the light hits just wrong. Now you're probably wondering, did everyone use this stuff? No. Ceruse and mercury-based creams were mostly used by the elite because they were expensive and difficult to make. But where nobles led, others followed. Merchant-class women copied the look with watered-down versions, chalk and flour pastes, or ground-up alabaster mixed with egg whites. None of it was skin-friendly. All of it got into your pores and probably shortened your life by a few years. What's fascinating and disturbing is how deeply these concoctions were linked to morality. Smooth white skin was more than just pretty. It symbolized virtue, wealth, and a soul untouched by worldly sin. Women who had scars, moles, or tanned skin were seen as morally suspect. There was even a belief that beauty on the outside reflected beauty on the inside. A clean white face meant a clean white soul. It's the original good vibes only aesthetic, except enforced with death paste. But wait, it gets worse. If your skin started to show the side effects of the poison you were rubbing on it daily, you'd be expected to hide that too. Blistering? Try a blend of rose water and crushed pearls. Skin turning gray. That's when you pull out the rouge, a toxic red dye made from cinnabar, aka mercury sulfide. That's right. To hide the effects of one poison, you applied another. Eventually, your whole routine was just chemical warfare happening in slow motion across your face. There's a weirdly charming footnote to all of this. Some women, particularly those in remote or rural areas, opted for homemade masks made from bread dough, honey, or even snail slime. Yes, snails. People believed that snail mucus could rejuvenate the skin. It sounds outlandish, but fun fact, snail mucin is now in high-end Korean skincare. So, hey, the medieval ladies may have gotten that one accidentally right. Still, that was the exception. For most, beauty was a ritual of slow decay. You'd wake up, scrub your face with vinegar and salt, apply lead-based paint, dab your cheeks with something red and questionable, powder it down with rice flour, and then pray it stayed on through mass and midday gossip. By evening, your face felt like a dry lake bed, cracking with each blink, each smile, each whispered comment about whose cousin was secretly in love with a monk. And of course, the cycle never stopped. The second you washed it off, your real skin looked worse, more sallow, more irritated, more human. You had no choice but to start again the next day and the day after that, until your skin no longer had anything left to give. Scholars still argue whether these cosmetics were used primarily for beauty or as a form of social control. Some believe the emphasis on paleness and perfection was a way to reinforce the power structure. Nobles above peasants, women above no one. Others think women used cosmetics to reclaim a sliver of control in a world that offered them very little. By painting your face, you shaped your own myth, even if the myth was slowly killing you. And then there's the question of how men fit into all this. Noblemen didn't usually wear makeup unless they were actors or very, very French. But they were often the ones praising, critiquing, and setting the standard for what women should look like. Artists painted impossibly smooth-faced ladies. Poets sang about women with porcelain skin and berry-red lips. Clerics wrote moral treatises about how vanity was evil unless it was beautiful. Hypocrisy, as always, was well-dressed. So now, back in your room, you open your small wooden box. Inside, your ceruse, your powdered cinnabar, your chalk, your oils. You look in the mirror. Your skin is blotchy, your cheeks raw. You dab, you blend, you smooth. You create the illusion of health, virtue, perfection. Later, as you walk through the halls, someone comments, "Your skin is like ivory." You smile and try not to think about how by 35 your teeth might fall out and your bones could start to ache for reasons no one understands yet. But tonight, you're glowing. You were ready to make everyone in court assume you were just too delicate to exist in this cruel, cruel world. This ideal wasn't just about looking unwell. It was about hinting at something deeper. A woman who looked physically weak was often assumed to be emotionally sensitive, artistically inclined, and spiritually advanced. Men wrote poems about their lovers as fading roses, melting snow, and ghostly maidens. You weren't supposed to be of this world. You were supposed to look like you were barely tolerating it. Now here's the creepy twist. The beauty of the sickly look blurred the line between life and death. It wasn't uncommon for women to be compared to corpses in love poems. "She lay still as marble," one poet wrote. "Her breath so light it stirred not the air." Romantic, right? Also mildly terrifying. But this was the mood. You didn't just want to look passive. You wanted to look perishable. A perfect example of this can be found in the court of Burgundy, where pale skin and sorrowful expressions became something of a competitive sport. Ladies would faint during church services, swoon during dances, and recover just in time to offer a small, trembling smile. One noblewoman reportedly claimed to drink only rosewater for an entire week before a royal banquet, so her skin would appear bloodless and divine. She didn't eat. She barely moved. She made a huge impression. Scholars still debate how much of this was conscious performance versus actual illness. After all, medieval Europe was crawling with diseases and nutrition wasn't exactly balanced. A lot of women were genuinely unwell. But instead of worrying about that, society just aestheticized it. The line between sick and stylish blurred to the point where real health problems became a kind of fashion accessory. And if you think this trend faded with time, think again. The idealization of the suffering woman persisted well into the Renaissance, the Romantic period, and yes, even modern pop culture. There's something disturbingly timeless about a culture that praises a woman most when she's silent, fragile, and barely hanging on. Back in your candle-lit chamber, you examine your face in the polished bronze mirror. You've applied your white powder, a touch of crushed berries beneath your eyes, and your lips are tinted just enough to suggest you might have coughed blood recently. tastefully, of course. You lie back on your velvet daybed, draping an arm over your forehead with soft, theatrical flair. Later, in the great hall, someone leans over and whispers, "You look so delicate tonight, almost like you're not really here." You smile faintly. That's exactly the look you were going for. You're glowing, all right, but it's less the glow of health and more the faint shimmer of chemical exposure. Still, in the flickering torchlight of the great hall, no one sees the damage under the layers. They see the alabaster skin, the veiled golden hair, the modest smile. You've perfected the mask. But tonight, we're going to talk about a trend that took all this delicate dying swan beauty and gave it a proper Gothic twist. Because for a while, looking sick wasn't just fashionable, it was practically divine. Welcome to the age of the sickly look, when everyone wanted to appear one fainting spell away from sainthood. This wasn't some isolated aesthetic. It was woven through every painting, poem, and whispered rumor at court. Women were praised for looking pale to the point of translucent. Hollow cheeks, dark shadows under the eyes, even a slight bluish tint to the lips. These were beauty markers. These were beauty markers. It wasn't about radiance. It was about fragility. The goal was to appear physically delicate and emotionally subdued, as if the weight of the world or your own corset was just too much. The link between beauty and sickness wasn't new. In medieval Christian thought, suffering had redemptive value. Saints were beautiful in their affliction. Women who bore pain with grace were seen as spiritually elevated. So when you looked like you might swoon at any moment, it wasn't cause for alarm. It was cause for admiration. People assumed you were closer to God, more refined, more well-bred. It wasn't just a spiritual flex. There was a fashionable side to this too. The ideal courtly woman had thin wrists and ankles, pale fingers, a swan-like neck, and a spine that suggested you spent most of your day reclining dramatically on a cushioned bench. If you had a cough, even better. A little consumptive glow gave your cheeks a gentle flush and your lips a tragic hue. You looked like the heroine of a doomed romance, a medieval prequel to the Victorian tuberculosis chic. Let's talk fashion for a second. The gowns of this era were perfectly designed to exaggerate the fragile silhouette. Long draping sleeves and tight bodices made your arms look narrower and your waist smaller. Gowns were often cinched just under the bust, creating the illusion of height and delicacy. If your head looked a little too heavy for your body, that was ideal. You weren't supposed to look strong. You were supposed to look ornamental. Of course, you couldn't rely on clothing alone to pull off the sickly chic look. Makeup helped, especially lead-based powders that made your skin unnaturally white and powdery. But some women went a step further, using berries or beetroot to gently darken the under-eye area. That's right. They created the illusion of eye bags on purpose. Anything that made you look more tragic, more wan, more romantic was fair game. One particularly dramatic beauty trick involved gently pressing a cold spoon under the eyes to encourage slight swelling and bruising. The result? A soft, puffy under-eye shadow that whispered, "I haven't slept in days, and I've been weeping about my lover who died in the Crusades." Combine that with a fluttering fan and a strategically placed lace handkerchief, and by now you've mastered the look. Thin enough to look holy, pale enough to appear freshly embalmed and perfumed to the point of distraction. But just in case you thought this whole beauty circus was limited to women, allow me to direct your tired eyes to the young men of the medieval courts. No, they didn't get a free pass. Sure, they weren't bleaching their scalps with goat pee or smearing mercury under their eyes, but trust me, medieval masculinity came with its own punishing list of requirements. Tonight, let's talk about the impossible standards for men too. Because if you think your corset's tight, imagine trying to look brave, rich, and holy while surviving hand-to-hand combat. Start with the basics. The medieval dreamboat. He's tall, but not so tall that he looks awkward. He's lean but muscular. Ideally, a kind of wiry strength, like a sword with abs. His face, sharp, clean-shaven with a high forehead. Yes, they plucked hairlines too. A straight nose and clear, unblemished skin. His hands delicate but calloused in just the right places. You wanted to look like you read poetry by candlelight, but could still murder a guy before breakfast. So, how did men keep their skin smooth and their features sharp in a world with no barbershops, no razors, and a medical system that thought sneezing too hard might summon demons? The answer, very carefully and often painfully. Upper-class young men used tweezers to shape their brows and remove stray facial hairs. That's right, medieval manscaping. Some even used vinegar-based tonics to cleanse their skin and avoid breakouts since pimples were seen as signs of weak character or excessive lust. But beyond the face, a young nobleman's entire identity was wrapped up in his body and what he did with it. From childhood, he was trained for war, sport, and the extremely formal art of looking cool on a horse. This wasn't about health or fitness the way we think of it now. It was about image. Knights and squires were judged by how they carried themselves in armor, how gracefully they moved during a dance, and how well they recited romantic poetry to a lady without tripping over their own tights. And yes, tights were very much a thing. In fact, men's fashion during the later Middle Ages was just as tight, restrictive, and oddly revealing as anything women wore. Men wore hose that outlined their legs and buttocks in excruciating detail. Codpieces became so exaggerated in some courts that laws were eventually passed to tone them down. A well-dressed man might spend just as long as his female counterpart getting ready. Smoothing down his hair, adjusting his doublet, selecting his colors. Appearance was everything, and failure to look the part could ruin your chances of court success. One real historical figure who fit and broke these rules was Edward of Woodstock, better known as the Black Prince. He was the medieval poster boy for knightly perfection, skilled in battle, handsome, rich, well-dressed, and tragically doomed. His early portraits show a man with the classic look, strong nose, soft curls, and a fashion sense that screamed, "I'm ready for war," but also ready to pose for an oil painting. Later, illness ravaged him, and by the time he died young, he had morphed into exactly the kind of tragic male beauty medieval society adored. Noble, broken, unreachable. But the pressure on men wasn't just aesthetic. It was deeply moral and deeply performative. You had to be brave, yes, but not too emotional. Devout, but not boring. Courteous, but ready to fight to the death at a moment's notice. Every glance, every bow, every word spoken at court had to walk a tight rope of masculinity so narrow it made women's standards look almost flexible by comparison. And of course, there were consequences. Men who couldn't meet these expectations were mocked, dismissed, or worse, accused of being effeminate. In some medieval courts, a man who dressed too elaborately or spoke too softly risked being labeled unmanly, a vague but dangerous insult that could threaten your social standing. In a society that prized hierarchy and conformity, not fitting the mold was risky business. There's even a fringe theory still debated by historians that the rise of courtly love poetry was as much about controlling men as it was about romanticizing women. These poems painted male lovers as gentle, suffering, noble souls who worshipped their lady from afar. Sounds sweet until you realize it created an impossible role model. Real men were expected to act like fictional ones, chasing unattainable women while suppressing all the very human messiness underneath. You couldn't just be in love. You had to perform love like it was an art form and a test of character. Quirky side note, some medieval men wore beauty patches, tiny silk spots stuck to the face to cover blemishes or signal a certain fashion forwardness. Yes, they stole that one from the ladies. A patch on the cheek might say, "I'm flirtatious." A patch near the eye, "I'm dangerous but poetic." And somewhere, some knight in full plate armor was carefully placing a silk sticker on his nose and praying it didn't fall off during the joust. Of course, not every man had the luxury to worry about aesthetics. Peasant men were too busy trying not to starve. But in the elite world of castles and courts, looks were capital. A young man's prospects could rise or fall on the curve of his cheekbone or the shine of his boots. And once again, beauty wasn't just about attraction. It was about moral worth. A clean face meant a clean soul. A well-groomed knight was a godlier knight. And if you bled out on a battlefield looking hot, even better. So, here you are. Let's say you're a young lord this time. You've bathed, shaved, plucked, oiled, and laced yourself into hose so tight you're walking like you've just dismounted a warhorse. Your hair is curled, your collar is stiff, and your sword is mostly for show. You head to the great hall where ladies flutter fans and men pretend not to look exhausted. Someone claps you on the back and says, "Looking sharp today, like a painting come to life." You nod, smile slightly, say something poetic about the moon, then walk away, making sure your cloak billows behind you just right. Naturally, these clothes weren't breathable, so underneath all that finery, you were sweating constantly. And since you couldn't take off your gown in public, you just marinated in your own exhaustion. Your waist ached, your back cramped. You fanned yourself while pretending not to suffer because suffering was part of the look. You weren't supposed to be comfortable. You were supposed to look transcendent. Of course, there were exceptions. In private, noble women sometimes wore looser gowns, especially when pregnant or ill. But even then, the standards lingered. If guests came by unexpectedly, you'd better be ready to relace yourself and slap on a veil. Your body was a billboard, and every curve or wrinkle was up for interpretation. Now, here's a quirky little detail. Some young girls were introduced to lacing as early as age 12. It wasn't always tight at first, but over time, the laces got snugger, and the expectations grew heavier. The message was clear. Start early, learn to tolerate discomfort, and become one with your body cage. It's tradition, and scholars still argue over how damaging this was. Some believe early bodices weren't nearly as restrictive as Renaissance or Victorian corsets. Others point to skeletal remains showing warped ribs and compressed lungs, especially among noble women who spent decades in structured garments. The truth probably lies somewhere in the middle. Not everyone suffered the same way, but suffering was definitely part of the package deal. It's worth noting, too, that this wasn't always self-inflicted. The pressure came from all sides. Parents, suitors, the church, the court. Young women didn't just wake up one day and decide to lace themselves into immobility. They were told explicitly or implicitly that their value increased the smaller they became. And the tighter the bodice, the more marriageable they were, the more angelic they looked, the more admired they became. So here you are in your chamber again. Your maid pulls the laces on your kirtle. You grip the bedpost. Exhale. She tugs tighter. You try not to flinch. Once the waist is cinched, she smooths the fabric, then helps you into your outer gown. It feels like armor. Heavy, impossibly beautiful, impossibly exhausting. At court, you glide through the hall, spine straight, arms poised. You can't breathe deeply. You can't turn quickly, but you look exquisite. Someone whispers, "She's so graceful, like she floats." You smile faintly. You're not floating. You're being held together by 30 feet of linen and someone else's expectations. But the pressure on men wasn't just aesthetic. It was deeply moral and deeply performative. You had to be brave, yes, but not too emotional, devout, but not boring. Courteous, but ready to fight to the death at a moment's notice. Every glance, every bow, every word spoken at court had to walk a tight rope of masculinity so narrow it made women's standards look almost flexible by comparison. And of course, there were consequences. Men who couldn't meet these expectations were mocked, dismissed, or worse, accused of being effeminate. In some medieval courts, a man who dressed too elaborately or spoke too softly risked being labeled unmanly, a vague but dangerous insult that could threaten your social standing. In a society that prized hierarchy and conformity, not fitting the mold was risky business. There's even a fringe theory still debated by historians that the rise of courtly love poetry was as much about controlling men as it was about romanticizing women. These poems painted male lovers as gentle, suffering, noble souls who worshipped their lady from afar. Sounds sweet until you realize it created an impossible role model. Real men were expected to act like fictional ones, chasing unattainable women while suppressing all the very human messiness underneath. You couldn't just be in love. You had to perform love like it was an art form and a test of character. Quirky side note, some medieval men wore beauty patches. Tiny silk spots stuck to the face to cover blemishes or signal a certain fashion forwardness. Yes, they stole that one from the ladies. A patch on the cheek might say, "I'm flirtatious." A patch near the eye, "I'm dangerous but poetic." And somewhere, some knight in full plate armor was carefully placing a silk sticker on his nose and praying it didn't fall off during the joust. Of course, not every man had the luxury to worry about aesthetics. Peasant men were too busy trying not to starve. But in the elite world of castles and courts, looks were capital. A young man's prospects could rise or fall on the curve of his cheekbone or the shine of his boots. And once again, beauty wasn't just about attraction. It was about moral worth. A clean face meant a clean soul. A well-groomed knight was a godlier knight. And if you bled out on a battlefield looking hot, even better. So here you are. Let's say you're a young lord this time. You've bathed, shaved, plucked, oiled, and laced yourself into hose so tight you're walking like you've just dismounted a warhorse. Your hair is curled, your collar is stiff, and your sword is mostly for show. You head to the great hall where ladies flutter fans and men pretend not to look exhausted. Someone claps you on the back and says, "Looking sharp today, like a painting come to life." You nod, smile slightly, say something poetic about the moon, then walk away, making sure your cloak billows behind you just right, whether she actually did anything scandalous. Her mouth alone could suggest things the church would rather not discuss in polite company. There's even a record of a noblewoman in France whose marriage negotiations fell through after a rival court sent a portrait exaggerating her lip size. The message was clear. She was too sensual, too proud, too dangerous to be a wife. She ended up joining a convent. Her mouth apparently spoke louder than her actual words ever could. And then there was the matter of smiling. As we mentioned earlier, too much smiling was frowned upon, pun intended. A closed mouth was ideal. Slightly upturned corners. Perfect. A visible grin, suspicious. A full laugh, scandalous. Open laughter, especially with teeth, made a woman seem less mysterious, less controlled. And remember, mystery was currency. Too much emotion, especially joy, was read as immodest, even unfeminine. Your lips were supposed to hover between silence and suggestion, never fully committing to either. But not all lip-related messaging was visual. Some women, particularly in the French and Italian courts, wore scented balms that made the lips subtly aromatic. Rose-infused wax, clove oils, and honey-based glosses were popular among those who wanted to keep their mouths soft and inviting without appearing too forward. Again, it was all about balance. You couldn't look like you were trying. You had to smell like heaven, but seem like you'd never kissed anyone ever in your whole life. Not even a frog. There's a strange little fringe theory, too. Some historians believe that lip treatments were occasionally used as a kind of flirtation ritual. A woman might dab a bit of balm on in view of a particular man, her fingers lingering just a little too long. He'd get the message or he wouldn't. That was part of the game. The lips became both mask and magnet. Naturally, the debate continues. Some scholars argue that lip coloring was rare and mostly reserved for court performers, dancers, or women already labeled as fallen. Others insist that it was more common than we think, just done with more subtlety than we're used to. After all, most surviving records come from moralists and clergy, not the women themselves. And let's be honest. The women doing the best lip work were probably also the best at covering their tracks. So here you are again, seated at your vanity. You dip your finger into a tiny pot of pomegranate balm and gently pat it onto your lips. Not too much, just enough to catch the light. You blot with a linen cloth. Check your reflection, then close your mouth into the perfect soft line. Not a pout, not a smirk, not a smile. Later at the banquet, someone glances at you. His eyes flick to your mouth. You pretend not to notice, and you don't say a word. So you've powdered your face, starved your body, bleached your hair, and maybe even faked a fainting spell or two. You've committed to the look. But what if we told you it didn't stop there? Because long before the corset became the ultimate symbol of beauty through torture, medieval women had already mastered the art of physically reshaping their bodies with clothing. That's right. It's time to talk about the early precursors to corsets. The tight-laced bodices, the rigid kirtles, the bone-stiffened garments that squeezed women into silhouettes, dictated not by comfort, but by patriarchy and pageantry. Now, technically, the corset as we know it didn't fully arrive until the Renaissance. But let's not kid ourselves. Medieval noble women were already living that laced-up life. They wore fitted undergarments known as kirtles, or kirtles which had to be carefully laced to create a cinched-in waist and an elongated torso. You couldn't just pull one on like a comfy hoodie. These things required help, servants, patience, and a willingness to exhale for no one. The goal was always the same: to make the body conform to the ideal. A long, narrow torso, a small waist, gently sloping shoulders, and modestly rounded hips. Not too curvy, not too strong, just enough femininity to suggest you were capable of bearing children, but not enough to imply you might be good at it. Subtle, contained, decorative. Don't be fooled by the romantic paintings. Getting into these garments wasn't elegant. It involved awkward twisting, sucking in your breath, and trying not to gag as someone yanked on the laces behind you. Often the cords would dig into the ribs or bruise the sides if pulled too tight. Linen shifts worn underneath helped reduce chafing, but not much. And remember, there was no elastic, no spandex, no mercy. One real-world account comes from the household records of the Duchess of Berry, whose ladies-in-waiting reportedly spent up to an hour a day dressing her, just the torso section. Her undergarments had to be adjusted multiple times depending on the activity of the day, sitting for long hours, slightly loosened, public procession, pulled tighter to present a figure worthy of devotion. Translation: she needed to look like an elegant, tortured saint on wheels. And here's a wild little twist. In some cases, these garments weren't just form-fitting. They were actually reinforced with stiff materials like reed, whalebone, or even metal strips. These weren't corsets yet, but they were moving in that direction. The fashion was evolving, the torture intensifying. By the late 15th century, some bodices were so stiff, women couldn't bend at the waist. You didn't sit, you reclined. If you dropped something, you waited for a servant to pick it up. God forbid you needed to run. But that was the point. Running wasn't beautiful, and we haven't even touched the layers. Over the tightly fitted kirtle, you'd wear a gown, sometimes two. The outer gown might weigh 10 or 15 pounds with heavy embroidery, jewels, and thick velvet sleeves that swept the floor. The idea wasn't to move gracefully. It was to move like someone being slowly ushered towards sainthood. Slowness was beauty. Stillness was grace. Movement was for peasants. laced in, perfumed, pale as polished bone. You've done everything right. Or so you think. But tonight, we're zooming in on one last tiny detail that could unravel your entire aesthetic if you weren't careful. Your lips. That's right. Those two little lines of flesh on your face were a battlefield all their own. Because in the Middle Ages, lips weren't just for speaking. They were for signaling. And if you weren't careful, they could speak volumes about your morality, your class, your secrets, even when you kept them perfectly closed. Let's start with color. You might assume that rosy, healthy-looking lips were all the rage. You'd be wrong. Medieval beauty leaned toward the ethereal, the otherworldly. Bright red lips were considered a little too lively, too earthy, too lustful. And lust, as we've covered, was a serious aesthetic no. A slight pink tint, maybe. But anything darker could get you side-eyed by a priest or worse. Suspected of intentional temptation. And here's where things get complicated because cosmetics for lips did exist. Women used crushed berries, alkanet root, beet juice, and red wine residue to tint their lips. But this was a risky move. Depending on where you lived and who was watching, adding color to your mouth could mark you as vain, deceptive, or even demonic. A lot of religious authorities believed that women who painted their faces were hiding their true nature, literally trying to trap men with false beauty. And the lips, being so close to the sin of speech and kissing, were prime targets for suspicion. One particularly damning piece of folklore described a painted woman whose lips were so red they bled lies. Subtle, right? According to some priests, lip staining was a sure sign of a woman who would lead men astray. Better to leave them bare, pale, unreadable, because as with everything else in the Middle Ages, beauty was safest when it whispered, not shouted. Of course, not every woman bowed to the modesty police. In courts like those of Burgundy and Venice, where fashion pushed the boundaries of piety, subtle lip color became an elegant weapon. A well-placed hint of berry on the mouth told the world, I am refined, cultured, desirable, but not vulgar. It was a performance just like everything else. You weren't enhancing your lips. You were telling a story with them, a carefully edited story, one that walked the razor-thin line between saint and seductress. Here's a delicious little historical tidbit. In some noble households, there was actually a coded system for lip color. Darker stains applied very lightly were reserved for evening events, especially when the room would be dimly lit by candlelight. In firelight, the lips would appear flushed but not painted, warm but not wanton. Some beauty guides even suggested applying a first coat, blotting it, and then applying a second. Yes, medieval women invented layering. Take that, modern makeup hacks. But that wasn't the only secret language being spoken. Lip size mattered too. Small pursed lips were considered the height of refinement. They suggested self-control, discretion, chastity. Large or full lips, that was a problem. They hinted at appetite, both literal and metaphorical. A woman with generous lips might be mocked, gossiped about, or quietly avoided. Never mind. Your lips are silent, delicate, and maybe just the right shade of forbidden berry. You've mastered the face, the body, the posture, the scent. But none of that matters unless people know what it means. Because in the medieval world, beauty wasn't just about looking good. It was a walking resume, a moral verdict, a declaration of class and character. Tonight, we're peeling back the gilded layers to look at the deeper and much more dangerous equation that governed medieval life. Beauty equals wealth equals virtue. Now it sounds ridiculous, but in a society where God, gold, and gossip ruled supreme, your appearance did more than attract suitors. It told people what kind of soul you had. Smooth skin, that meant you were clean, both physically and spiritually. Pale complexion. You didn't labor in the sun like a peasant. You were preserved, refined, closer to heaven. Perfect posture, symmetrical features, white hands, and dainty feet. All signs that you were born into the right kind of family, and therefore, presumably born good. This wasn't just cultural fluff. This was doctrine. Medieval theologians and philosophers wrote treatises insisting that beauty was evidence of divine favor. If you looked good, it was because God had made you that way, on purpose, as a sign to the world. You are physically beautiful because you were morally beautiful. And the reverse was assumed just as confidently. Flaws of the body, flaws of the soul. Now imagine what this meant for anyone who didn't fit the mold. A crooked nose might mark you as devious. A birthmark could mean you were cursed. Too much hair might warrant a double check for demonic influence. Even scars from accidents or illness weren't viewed neutrally. They were read like warnings. People believed the body revealed the truth of the inner self. And that was a terrifying standard to live under. And let's not forget money's role in this mess. Because of course, the ideal medieval beauty, like most things in history, was expensive. The lotions, the powders, the gowns, the delicate veils, none of it came cheap. Peasant women couldn't afford saffron hair rinses or imported perfumes. They couldn't even afford mirrors, let alone the time to sit in front of them. And so the ability to be beautiful became exclusive, a symbol of status just as much as a coat of arms. Even features themselves were linked to wealth. Thinness was often celebrated because it meant you didn't work the fields. Fragility suggested you were cared for, kept indoors, sheltered. Long fingers showed you never had to grip a shovel. Smooth hands said you didn't sew, wash, or knead bread. The farther removed you were from labor, the more angelic your body became in the public imagination. Now you might be wondering, did people really buy this nonsense? Oh yes, it was baked into the medieval worldview. Artists painted noble women with flawless faces and elongated proportions because that's what people believed virtue looked like. Poets waxed rhapsodic about their lady's alabaster brow or her slender ankles. Not just to say she's pretty, but to say she's good. Her outer beauty confirmed her inner worth. One particularly illustrative case comes from the court of Eleanor of Aquitaine. Her ladies-in-waiting were chosen not just for their noble bloodlines, but for their virtues. A polite way of saying they were young, thin, pale, and composed. Court documents describe their beauty with the same reverence usually reserved for relics. Their poise, their elegance, their symmetry, all signs that they were not only suitable companions, but moral exemplars. Now here's where it gets really dark. Because this worldview didn't just reward the beautiful, it punished those who couldn't perform beauty. Ugly or disfigured women were often assumed to be wicked. Think witches, old crones, or temptresses in disguise. If you weren't beautiful, people didn't just pity you. They feared you. You were unnatural, dangerous, possibly unholy. There's even a recorded incident in 13th century Spain where a noblewoman accused her rival of witchcraft after she developed a facial rash. The logic? A good woman would never be so afflicted. The accused was later acquitted, but the damage was done. Her social standing crumbled, not because of what she did, but because of how she looked. And men weren't immune either, though the rules were slightly different. A handsome knight was considered more trustworthy, more heroic, a misshapen one, possibly a trickster or a traitor. This wasn't just aesthetics. It was a moral system enforced through cheekbones and clear skin. Of course, not everyone agreed with this madness. There were skeptics. Writers like Christine de Pizan, one of the first female authors to make a name for herself in Europe, openly challenged the link between beauty and virtue. She argued that women should be judged by their actions, not their appearances. Radical, right? She didn't win the war, but her words planted seeds that would bloom centuries later. Even today, scholars debate how much people actually believed in this beauty equals goodness nonsense. Was it literal, symbolic, convenient? Probably all three. It made life easier for the powerful and harder for everyone else. And that's usually how these systems work. Back in your chamber, you adjust your veil in the mirror. Your skin is powdered, your cheeks faintly flushed, your posture perfect. But tonight you feel it. Beneath the layers of silken meaning, there's a hum of anxiety. You've been watched all day, evaluated, praised, and silently judged. A maid brings in a letter. A suitor has written a poem. He calls you an angel of form and faith. You read the words and smile because you're supposed to. But you wonder if your skin was scarred, if your body was different, if you laughed too loud or frowned too often. Would he still see the angel or just a woman? You've spent the day sculpting yourself into a living statue of virtue, powdered, veiled, well-mannered, and ghostly pale. You've learned how to perform wealth, display chastity, and shrink into the outlines expected of you. But what if you didn't fade quietly into the background? What if you leaned into the silence, into the thinness, into the pallor, and became something not just invisible, but holy? Tonight, we descend deeper into the strange and sacred world where beauty, death, and sanctity blur. Where the ideal body wasn't just delicate, it was practically disintegrating. Welcome to the age of the heavenly body where the most admired women were saints, and saints often looked like stylish skeletons. Now we've talked already about the obsession with looking pale, frail, and on the verge of collapse. But religious women, especially those canonized after death, took that aesthetic to its extreme. They weren't just admired for being thin. They were venerated for being nearly gone. Their bodies were supposed to be consumed by faith, literally wasted away in devotion. You weren't just close to God. You were evaporating into Him. Take Saint Clare of Assisi. She reportedly fasted so severely that she needed to be propped up to attend Mass. Her eyes were sunken, her cheeks hollow, her body barely able to stand. But in art, she's portrayed as radiant, glowing, elevated. The physical toll of her fasting becomes its own kind of luminous beauty. She's not ill, she's transfigured. There's a term scholars use for this phenomenon: anorexia mirabilis, miraculous lack of appetite. In today's terms, we'd call it an eating disorder wrapped in sanctimony. But in the Middle Ages, it was divine. Women who abstained from food were admired for their self-control, their detachment from the sinful flesh. It didn't matter that they were dying. In fact, it mattered more if they were. The thinner, the holier. And this ideal didn't stay locked in monasteries. It leaked out into the broader culture. Noble women who modeled themselves on these saintly figures would mimic their habits, cutting down their meals, sleeping on uncomfortable beds, refusing comfort in favor of spiritual elegance. Some even wore tight cords or belts around their waists, not for fashion, but as symbols of bodily rejection, a corset of faith, if you will. One woman, Margaret of Cortona, was so committed to her penance that she wore a spiked chain under her dress. Her body was permanently marked by her devotion, and this too was beautiful. When she died, people collected her belongings as relics. Her pain became legacy. Her broken body, a monument. You start to see the pattern. Women's suffering wasn't just tolerated, it was aestheticized. And it didn't stop with fasting. Illness, injury, disfigurement, if framed correctly, could elevate a woman's image to something nearly supernatural. In some cases, actual corpses became objects of worship. Saintly women who died untouched were exhumed, examined, and if they looked suitably preserved, displayed. Yes, displayed. You might walk into a chapel and see the mummified body of a nun laid out in glass, her bones wrapped in lace, her face covered by a painted wax mask of eternal youth. And people loved it. They prayed to these bodies. They kissed their coffins. They believed the closer you got to their remains, the more your own soul might benefit. The ideal woman didn't just die beautifully. She stayed beautiful after death. Corpse, but make it holy. Let's not pretend this was entirely about religion. There was a voyeuristic thrill in gazing upon these dead, delicate figures. Their stillness was seductive. Their silence was complete. They couldn't talk back. They couldn't demand anything. Just like the perfect medieval lady, seen but never fully known. And here's the extra creepy layer. This obsession filtered into secular art, too. Portraits of noble women often mimic the features of saintly corpses. Elongated faces, hollowed cheeks, calm expressions, pale skin with no blemish or pulse. The woman wasn't alive in the traditional sense. She was eternal, untouched by aging, untouched by flesh, untouched by you. It didn't stop at death. The beauty of saints often had to be defended posthumously. If a saint's corpse decayed too fast, it was considered suspicious. If she started to smell bad, even worse. The smell of decay was seen as a sign of corruption. That's why odor of sanctity became a thing. Some saints' bodies were said to emit the scent of flowers after death. Literally the smell of roses, lilies, myrrh. Sainthood didn't just look pretty. It was supposed to smell pretty too. No pressure. There's one case where this got particularly weird. Saint Zita of Lucca's body, which allegedly remained intact for centuries, was once examined and described in loving detail by church officials. Her tiny feet, her delicate hands, the state of her teeth, all cataloged like a bridal checklist. You'd think they were shopping for a wife, not preserving a relic. Scholars have long debated the meaning of all this. Was it about purity, control, the ultimate erasure of female agency? Probably all of the above. These saintly bodies offered a fantasy of perfect womanhood. No appetite, no resistance, no decay, just beauty in the shape of surrender. But not every woman went along with it. Some rebelled. Hildegard of Bingen, for example, was canonized despite being loud, opinionated, and very much alive in her lifetime. She didn't shrink into pious silence. She wrote music, science, and philosophy. Her portraits show her with her eyes wide open, mouth slightly parted, ready to speak. She was a rare exception, a woman allowed to be both brilliant and visible, but her kind was rare. So now it's evening. You sit in the convent's quiet chapel, candlelight flickering off the silver bones of a saint displayed in a glass case. Her smile is painted on her face, a mask of eternal serenity. Around you, other women pray. You close your eyes and fold your hands. And for a moment you wonder, is this peace? Is this power? Or is this just the final form of disappearing? You leave the chapel in silence, the image of the saint's preserved face still lingering in your mind like smoke after incense. But as you step into the long gallery of the manor house, you're reminded that beauty didn't just live in the flesh. It was sewn, painted, and woven into every surface that surrounded you. Tonight, we're taking a detour into the visual archives of the medieval imagination. The art of beauty, or more specifically, how beauty was filtered, edited, and broadcast through the curated illusions of tapestries, paintings, and manuscripts. The original medieval thirst traps. Let's start with the basics. Medieval art was never trying to be realistic. This wasn't Instagram. It was propaganda. Noble women depicted in illuminated manuscripts had impossible proportions. Long necks, tiny waists, limbs like soft reeds, and faces that all looked suspiciously alike. Smooth, pale, serene. They weren't portraits so much as wish lists. Each figure wasn't just a woman. She was an emblem of virtue, status, and the aesthetics of the moment. In tapestries, the exaggeration was turned up to 11. You'd see scenes of courtly love, where women reclined under trees, playing lutes, or gently restraining falcons with wrists more delicate than a breadstick. Their hair spilled in golden waves, their gowns floated like mist, and their expressions were frozen somewhere between holy indifference and bored eroticism. These weren't snapshots of real life. They were fantasy stitched in silk. One famous example, the Lady and the Unicorn Tapestry series. Each panel shows a woman in a surreal symbolic garden surrounded by animals, jewels, and elaborate florals. Her features remain almost identical across the 6 works. Same pale face, same calm gaze, same mysterious smirk that practically says, "I've never pooped." She's not meant to be a person. She's an ideal, an icon, and thousands of women were expected to somehow live up to her woven perfection. And let's not forget manuscript art. Illuminated books, especially religious texts, were full of miniatures showing women who practically glowed. Saintly maidens, noble wives, allegorical figures. They all had a strange clone-like beauty. Long golden hair, eyes downcast, lips barely there. Even when they were being tortured, as saints often were, they looked peaceful, ethereal, unbothered. Because nothing says spiritual triumph like being burned at the stake with flawless eyeliner. The artists weren't being lazy. They were following the script. The church, the nobility, and the artists themselves were all invested in maintaining a visual shorthand. This is what beauty looks like, and beauty equals goodness. So, the models for these illustrations weren't actual women. They were formulaic, a checklist of the right features, endlessly repeated across borders and generations. And this matters because these images weren't just decoration. They taught people how to see. A young girl flipping through her father's book of hours wasn't just learning prayers. She was absorbing a message about what she should look like. A courtier admiring a tapestry wasn't just appreciating craftsmanship. He was calibrating his expectations for real women. The art was both mirror and mold. It gets weirder. Some noble families actually commissioned portraits of their daughters that deliberately edited reality. Just like modern airbrushing, artists would elongate necks, lighten skin, smooth wrinkles, even tweak jawlines. This wasn't deception. It was expected. One letter from a 15th-century Italian merchant to a portrait artist politely requests that the painter brighten the lady's eyes, lessen the nose, and improve the posture. Basically, make her hot, but tastefully. Even men got in on the illusion game. Portraits of noble women often included symbols to reinforce the image. A small dog to show loyalty. A book for intelligence. A lily for purity. A tiny unicorn. Yes, unicorns were big in this era, for untouchable chastity. Every detail was curated. Every object served the story. You weren't just looking at a person. You were being told what to believe about her. But the flip side, real women could never live up to these images. No one had that much hair. No one's skin glowed in candlelight like a polished pearl. No one could sit for that long without getting a cramp. The art created expectations that real life could never meet. And yet, women still tried. Bleaching hair, tightening bodices, swallowing herbs to stay slim, practicing the perfect downcast gaze in case someone important looked their way. There's even a strange scholarly debate about whether these idealized images caused psychological harm. Some historians argue they reinforced damaging stereotypes and limited women's freedom of expression. Others think they offered a kind of escapism, a chance to imagine oneself as something more refined, more admired. But whether aspirational or oppressive, the images shaped medieval self-perception just as much as they shaped public taste. A quirky example, in a few surviving tapestries, women are shown applying makeup or fixing their hair. Proof that even inside the illusion, there was an acknowledgement of the effort behind the fantasy. One shows a lady using a mirror while her maid stands by with a jar of rouge. Another features a noble woman discreetly removing her shoe, possibly to rest her aching feet. A small crack in the perfection, but a telling one. And so now you find yourself walking through your family's gallery. Painted eyes follow you down the corridor. You pass portraits of ancestors you've never met, each more flawless than the last. Gowns that seem to float, eyes that never blink. None of them look like you, but all of them tell you what you should be. You pause before one. The Lady Eloise, your great-grandmother. Her face is still and pale, lips faintly curved in a smile that's probably just the artist's flourish. She looks perfect. She looks nothing like the stories you've heard about her temper. You reach up and touch your own face. Your skin is warm. Your eyes are tired. You're very much alive. And somehow that feels like a rebellion. You've wandered through painted illusions and stitched up perfection. Seen yourself reflected in 100 faces that were never truly yours. But tonight, we're dropping down from the clouds of courtly art and into something far more grounded. Literally, we're talking about feet. Yes, the humble, often hidden, occasionally fetishized medieval foot. It turns out, even down at your toes, beauty standards lurked. And while most people didn't go around showing off their bunions, that didn't stop society from dreaming up elaborate fantasies about what made a foot desirable or disgraceful. First, the basics. In medieval Europe, feet were supposed to be small, narrow, and elegant, basically impossible for anyone who actually used them for walking. The ideal foot was delicate, high-arched with well-shaped toes, and ideally so dainty it never had to touch anything unpleasant like mud, dirt, or, God forbid, labor, which is hilarious given the actual state of roads back then. Unpaved, uneven, and frequently decorated with medieval surprises. But that's the thing with beauty standards. They're never about reality. They're about aspiration, and aspiring not to have to use your feet was apparently quite chic. So, how did people show off something that was usually hidden under layers of cloth and leather? Through shoes, of course, and medieval shoes were doing the absolute most. Pointed shoes called poulaines became a fashion craze among the nobility, especially in the 14th and 15th centuries. These things were absurd. Some had tips that extended 5, 6, even 12 inches beyond the actual toes, stuffed with moss or wool to hold their shape. The longer the point, the higher your status. They were designed for strutting, not standing. And if you're wondering how anyone walked in them, well, mostly they didn't. The ultra-wealthy were carried in litters or rode horses while their shoes flopped majestically beneath them like limp baguettes. There's a surviving pair in a museum that literally curls upward like a curly fry. Functional? No. Fabulous? Also no. But fashionable? Absolutely. It's a miracle no one tripped to death on them. Though there are records of city officials banning excessively long poulaines during festivals for fear of public nuisance and injury. For women, the stakes were different. While men's shoes screamed, "Look how ridiculous my wealth allows me to be," women's footwear whispered. "Look how small and soft and unthreatening I am." A noble woman's shoe was often more slipper than boot, narrow, flat, with soft soles made of leather or cloth. They offered little protection, which was kind of the point. If your shoes couldn't handle mud, It meant you had someone to carry you over it. There's a particularly wild example from medieval Paris where a noblewoman was said to have hired 2 servants just to walk ahead of her during rainy days, laying cloths down so she wouldn't have to soil her slippers. The image is ridiculous. A parade of modesty wrapped in layers of luxury, her feet never touching the real world. Like a saint, but with more attitude. Foot size, too, carried its own mythology. Small feet were praised in poetry as a mark of feminine virtue. Literally feet like flower petals, or as light as swan's down. If that sounds impossible, that's because it was. And still, women tried to meet the standard. Some girls were encouraged to keep their shoes snug to prevent their feet from spreading. While not quite the bone-breaking process of Chinese foot binding, the intent was similar. Restrict natural growth for the sake of delicate aesthetics. Of course, most women didn't have the luxury of caring about dainty feet. Peasant women needed strong soles and practical boots to work fields, carry loads, and trudge through every weather. But even they weren't immune to foot-related scrutiny. Cracked heels or dirt-caked toenails could become marks of shame. Another reason why women covered their feet completely, even in private. Here's where things get particularly bizarre. Some courtly love poems included detailed foot descriptions. Knights would wax poetic about their lady's arched instep or the whiteness of her heel. That's right. Someone out there was singing for a heel. In fact, there's a poem from 14th century Castile where a man literally describes a woman's feet as holy relics, which is a level of foot worship you probably weren't expecting from a guy in chainmail. And yet, the foot could also be dangerous. Barefoot women appeared in religious art, usually to signal penance or humility. Mary Magdalene is often shown without shoes, her feet dusty from the road, a contrast to the perfumed, jeweled versions of beauty preferred by the upper class. The barefoot image also had connotations of vulnerability, even sensuality. A woman with bare feet was exposed. Maybe holy, maybe fallen. Either way, she wasn't neutral. There's also the issue of smell. Let's be real. Shoes back then didn't breathe. Foot odor wasn't just possible. It was inevitable, which led to some inventive attempts at deodorizing. Some noblewomen stuffed their shoes with rosemary, dried lavender, or even slices of lemon peel to keep things fresh. One beauty guide from the 15th century recommends steeping the feet in wine and ash to cleanse them of both odor and sin. Whether that worked is debatable. Whether it stung is not. So, what happens when your feet don't meet the standard? You cover them. You keep them quiet. You don't draw attention to them unless you're certain they'll pass inspection. There's even a fringe theory that some women took to dragging their skirts slightly longer than necessary, not just for modesty, but to hide large or misshapen feet. Your shoes might sparkle, but only if your toes deserve to be seen. So, here you are, back in your chamber, preparing for yet another long day of being admired while pretending you aren't. Your maid helps you into your slipper-like shoes, gently tugging the silk ribbons at the ankle. You wiggle your toes, sore from yesterday's feast. The soles are already worn, and the heels ache, but the shoes look divine. Later at court, you sit by the fire, ankles crossed, feet perfectly posed beneath your gown. A knight kneels nearby, eyes drifting just barely to where your shoes peek out. He smiles faintly. You smile back. I wonder how long you can sit like this before the pain makes your toes cramp. It's morning again. You're up before the sun, not because you're excited to greet the day, but because looking effortless in medieval court life takes, well, effort. Hours of it. So, tonight we're finally opening the heavy oak door to a place most men of the age never saw. The noblewoman's daily beauty routine. Spoiler alert, there's nothing dreamy about it. This was beauty through pain. A ritual of exhaustion where glamour didn't just cost time and coin. It cost circulation, personal space, and at least a few layers of your skin. Let's start with the wake-up call. Your servant brings in a basin of cold water, frigid, because heating water means lighting a fire, which means time, which means no. You splash your face, grit your teeth, and then begin the process of cleansing. This involves a cloth scrubbed over your skin with vinegar or a blend of wine and crushed herbs. It smells sharp, stings a bit, and leaves your face somewhere between fresh and faintly inflamed. But redness is better than blemishes, and as we've covered, your skin must say purity, even if your pores are screaming. Next, the whitening. You dab on your homemade Cerusse vinegar-aged lead paste because pale isn't just pretty, it's the moral high ground. It goes on thick, cold, and chalky. You smooth it with a piece of linen. Blend as best you can and try not to think about the fact that this will rot your face from the inside out in a few decades. That's future you's problem. Present you as a courtly luncheon to attend. If your cheeks are looking too bloodless, it's time for a little rouge. Crushed cochineal beetles or alkanet root mixed with egg white or animal fat makes a decent blush. You apply it in faint circles, careful not to overdo it. Too pink and you look like a tavern girl. Just enough and you look like someone who woke up blessed, not busy. Your lips, maybe a touch of balm, lightly tinted, not too red. We don't want the wrong kind of attention. Then the hair. If you followed the standard religious rules, you haven't washed it for a while. Instead, you've kept it oiled and combed, wrapped in linen at night. Today, it's time to shape it. If you're unmarried, you can let a little of it show under your veil. If you're married, it must be hidden. No questions asked. Your maid helps you brush it out, then plaits it tightly. You groan when she hits a knot. She apologizes quietly and keeps going. Once it's braided, you wrap it around your head, pin it into place, and slide on your coif. Another layer, then the veil, maybe the wimple, depending on how religious the day is looking. Dressing takes another hour. First the shift, plain linen, then the kirtle laced tightly at the sides, compressing your waist, your ribs, your breath. You brace yourself against a post while your maid pulls the laces tighter. You exhale when she's done, only to inhale and feel your torso hit a wall of stiffened fabric. There's no room in here for digestion or opinions. Over that goes your outer gown, velvet if you're rich enough, wool if you're merely privileged. You check the embroidery. Any damage or pilling could be interpreted as neglect, and neglect is just a fancy word for moral failure. You select your jewelry, modest, unless you're trying to make a statement. You lace on your shoes if you can reach them. If not, your maid does it for you. She's used to it. Now comes the hard part. Walking. The goal is to glide. You've practiced this. Back straight, shoulders relaxed, feet close together, steps small. No swaying, no bouncing. Your gown weighs nearly 15 pounds. If you lean forward too much, you'll trip on the hem. If you lean back, you'll strain your spine. And all of this happens while pretending not to notice you're dressed like a bedazzled sarcophagus. Breakfast is light. If you eat at all, a bit of fruit, a piece of bread, diluted wine. Eating too much makes you sluggish, and sluggishness is unbecoming. Your stomach already feels tight under your gown. You sit with perfect posture while your husband discusses crops or politics with other men. You're not expected to contribute. You're expected to look vaguely interested. Then appearances. If you're going to court, you must be impeccable. Your skin must remain matte, your breath fresh. You chew mint, suck cloves, maybe sip rose water if your throat gets dry. You smile occasionally, but never too broadly. You laugh only when it's safe. You speak only when directly addressed. You sit for hours, stiff and composed, your limbs aching under layers of brocade and expectation. Midday means prayers, embroidery, maybe a stroll in the garden if your shoes can handle the terrain. You mustn't sweat. Sweat is common, peasant, and undignified. If it's hot, you carry a fan. If it's freezing, you pretend it isn't. Comfort is not your job. Grace is. By evening, your skin itches under the lead paint. Your breath is sore from the braids. Your corset has left faint bruises on your ribs. You retreat to your chamber where your maid helps you undress one layer at a time. You sigh as the laces are loosened. You peel away the veil, the coif, the jewelry. You catch a glimpse of your real face in the polished metal mirror. Under the paint and powder, you're tired. Red blotches have formed along your jaw. Your lips are dry. She helps you wash with warm rose water. You sit still, eyes closed. Then comes the ointment, something to soothe the burning from the cosmetics, though it won't really help. She rubs it gently into your cheeks. You thank her. She bows and leaves. And now you're alone. You lie in bed, face clean, skin tingling. Tomorrow it will all start again. The powder, the binding, the perfect steps, the watchful stares. Beauty isn't a blessing. It's a regime. A job with no wages and no days off. You close your eyes and dream. Not of nights or gowns or whispered compliments, but of walking barefoot in the grass with your hair unbound and no one watching. It's nearly midnight now, and your chamber is quiet. Too quiet. The fire's just embers, the last of the wax candles giving off the faintest warm glow. You lie back, head resting on a pillow stuffed with goose feathers and the weight of everything. Your gown, your thoughts, your entire life lived under the thumb of someone else's ideals, settles into your bones. But before we let you drift off, there's one last thing we have to talk about. Because the truth is, medieval beauty standards didn't die with the Middle Ages. They didn't vanish when the wimples came off or when lead-based makeup fell out of fashion. They just mutated, hid themselves behind modern mirrors and digital filters, only slightly less obvious and no less cruel. Let's not kid ourselves. We've inherited the same toxic logic. The demand to be beautiful and pure, attractive but modest, youthful forever, even if it means pretending you slept 8 hours. And the worst part, we still believe that how we look somehow tells the world what kind of person we are. Kind, competent, trustworthy, desirable. Good skin equals a good soul. Straight teeth and a slim waist still mean you must be doing something right. It's the same lie, just dressed in new fabrics. Scroll through social media and you'll see the medieval mindset everywhere. No makeup tutorials designed to make you look effortless. Photoshopped portraits claiming to be authentic. Beauty products sold with promises of virtue, clean beauty, pure formulas, natural glow. We're not calling it piety anymore, but the language is familiar. It's still about being seen as better without being seen trying. And don't even get started on aging. Wrinkles are fine lines, something to be erased with creams, lasers, or filters that literally blur your face into nothing. You're supposed to remain youthful forever, but naturally. Don't age, but don't look like you're fighting it. Don't look old, but don't act like you care either. Sound familiar? That's a straight-up Gothic remix of the same medieval pressure to appear untouched by time. Want to wear makeup? You better make it invisible. Want to be sexy? Better make it accidental. Want to be noticed, but not too much. Complimented, but not envied. Desirable, but only in ways that won't scare the people doing the desiring. In short, you still can't win. Because somewhere deep down, society still loves a woman who disappears into her beauty, who glows without effort, who ages without changing, who speaks without being loud. And if you've ever felt exhausted by that, it's not your fault. You were born into a system that's been refining this performance for centuries. That voice in your head saying, "You need to fix this." When you see your reflection, that's a medieval monk still whispering across time. The ad campaign that promises radiant skin and inner confidence. That's a 14th century sermon wrapped in a Sephora receipt. And those filtered photos of flawless people who swear they woke up like this. Tapestries, every last one of them. There's a reason these ideals persist. They sell things. They keep you busy. They keep you doubting. And they stop you from asking better questions about value, about power, about what happens when you choose to opt out. Because here's the secret most people don't want to admit. Beauty isn't truth. It's theater. And you've been a leading lady in someone else's script for way too long. But here's the radical part. You're still here. You've survived the centuries. The plucked hairlines, the corseted ribs, the sickly pale faces, the saintly smiles, the powdered lies. You sitting here reading this have outlived every lie they told you about what a woman should look like. You are proof that beauty does not own you. You can scrub it off, step out of it, laugh in its face. You can let the lines come. You can keep your curves or change them for you. Not for the echo of some nun with a paintbrush whispering modesty. You can decide your own reflection matters, not because of what it sells, but because of what it says. You've met every version of the standard, and none of them ever loved you back. So maybe now in this quiet hour with your hair unbraided and your face bare and no one watching, you can love yourself for something deeper. Not as a saint, not as a seductress, not as a symbol, just as a person with a heartbeat and a body that has carried you through this impossible, beautiful mess of expectations and still said, I'm here. So go on, turn out the candle. Close your eyes. You've played the role. You've earned your rest. Let the beauty standards fall asleep without you tonight.